Over this last weekend, there was extremely tricky wildfire conditions, including a red flag warning, which led to some big developments when it comes to our major fires like the August Complex, the North Complex, the Creek Fire, and the Bobcat Fire. Unfortunately, it also led to some new fires that have been rapidly expanding over the last 24 hours. So we've got a lot to talk about in this video. One thing I will mention is I recognize these videos have gotten rather long because there's so much to cover, and I was trying to figure out this morning where I could cut some information to make the video shorter, but I decided that goes against the major goal I have in making these videos, so I'm just going to continue to report on as much information as I possibly can. And if you don't have all that much time or you're only interested in one fire, you can go to the comments where you'll see I put the time steps for the various fires. You can click on one of those time steps and it'll take you directly to the fire that you're most interested in. So again, lots to talk about. Let's just dive right in. You can see it looks a lot worse than it did towards the end of last week, and especially up here in Northern California. Last week, we had relatively moderate conditions. It was mild temperatures, winds weren't too bad, and relative humidity was higher than we've seen. Well, over this last weekend, we had that red flag warning, which really led to some active fire behavior, and unfortunately, even some new fires, as you see in the North Bay here. So, also unfortunately, that red flag warning is continuing throughout the day today, which is going to lead to some extremely tricky wildfire conditions for all of our firefighters and for wildfire growth in general. The thing we always talk about in this video are the weather conditions, and the three most important when it comes to fires are hot, dry, windy. If it's hot, that makes sense, wildfires are going to be worse, and here you can see it's about 100 digits in Santa Rosa, as well as the majority of California is in that extreme heat range. The next thing that we worry about is humidity, and you can see throughout the day today, dry air is just going to fill in over basically all of California, and it's some of the driest air we have seen this wildfire season. Again, why that's important: if the air is dry, then it dries out the vegetation. And if you've ever gone to a campfire and tried to start a fire with a wet log or a dry log, it makes sense that the drier the vegetation is, the faster and hotter the fire is going to burn. Now, the next thing we always talk about is winds. And this is actually the major thing I'm worried about right now. It's these extreme wind gusts that we see around the North Complex and then down where we have this new fire that I'm about to talk about in a second here. So all these conditions, hot, dry, windy, are creating a red flag warning for basically all of Northern California, and then even some spots in Southern California that I'll point out too. So basically what a red flag warning means is it's going to be easier for new fires to start, as we saw yesterday, and then once fires do start, or if some fires are still burning from 2 weeks ago, it has the potential for rapid fire spread, which is something we're seeing in the North Complex right now. So this timing, it started Saturday night, really active behavior yesterday, and it's continuing to Monday afternoon. Now, this is about as bad as we've seen it, possibly some 65 mile per hour wind gusts in the gaps and canyons. That's, I think, mostly for the North Complex where we're getting some of the most extreme conditions, but the air is another thing I'm really worried about. The air is about as dry as I've seen throughout this entire season, and especially when we get to the forecast for the Bobcat Fire. So let's actually dive into our individual fires. That's kind of the broad scope of what we're dealing with. There's a red flag warning in effect throughout the day today, going to lead to extreme fire behavior all day today, and then throughout this week, it's unfortunately going to remain warm and dry, although those wind gusts will go down a little bit. So the first fire I want to talk about here is this new fire, because as you can see based on the satellite imagery, the fire behavior is about as extreme as you're ever going to see. How much smoke is coming off on this? It shows that there is a lot of active fire growth happening right now. And I was actually flying down from Montana yesterday, and out the window you could see the pyrocumulonimbus cloud that was being created by this fire. Basically what that means is the fire creates so much rising motion that it creates its own thunderstorm. So that was something I could see out of the window of the airplane, and it looks like those extreme smoke and fire behavior conditions are continuing today. So this fire, this is a new one, it is the glass fire, and we can actually get another view of it in real time what this is looking like. This is the last 15 minutes, and you can see that the smoke is just blowing up in the mountains of Napa and working its way into Sonoma County. So, looking at the fire perimeter map, first thing I'll point out is where this red flag is. As you can see, basically all of Northern California and some of the select spots in here see some of the worst wildfire conditions, honestly, I've seen this entire season. But first thing we'll talk about is the glass fire here. And if I zoom out, one thing you'll notice, it's right to the west of the LNU lightning complex that was burning about a month ago. So you can see this fire is about as active as we ever see a fire look. These maps show the fire perimeter, and then the red dots show where there's active hotspots and fire burning, and you can see how fast this thing is blowing up. That would show the perimeter from yesterday, and you can see how much of this active fire is outside of the previous fire perimeter. So it gives you an idea of how fast it's growing. Major thing I'm concerned about here is how close this is getting to Santa Rosa. So that is definitely what you want to see. You don't want to see, as this fire is pushing into some highly populated areas. But the other thing you notice is the entire perimeter of this thing is still actively growing. With some of our other fires, it'll be burning a little in the north, maybe one spot in the east, maybe one spot in the southwest. This entire fire perimeter is still actively growing, so this is the number one fire that I'm watching right now. Now, I will also say that my cousin was on this fire last night, and he said it was extremely windy in this area, some tricky fire conditions, and some of the most extreme fire behavior that he has seen associated, again, with this new fire called the glass fire. Here you can see it started about 4 a.m. on Sunday, and it's already up to 11,000 acres. And I would imagine this acreage is just going to continue to grow and grow every single time this page gets updated. As you can see, it's growing in every direction right now. No surprise here, it is at 0% containment. I believe right now one of the main priorities is just on evacuations and life safety, hopefully trying to protect some structures. But again, this is an active development area. There's not a whole lot of information, so be sure to check these evacuations you see here. And I guess where there is some good news, we do have over 1,000 personnel on this fire already. So that's amazing to see. There have been so many resources already thrown at this fire, and it's only been around for about a day. There's 26 crews, 5 helicopters, 133 engines, 35 dozers, and 22 water tenders. Now, when it comes to the forecast, this area is looking extremely tricky over the next 24 hours, I'm not going to lie. Today, you see that red flag warning is in effect, and we could be seeing some triple digits in the Santa Rosa area. Now, you will notice that the temperatures will be going down tomorrow, and that red flag warning disappears, so that at least is some good news. Those 50 mile per hour wind gusts aren't going to be continuing all week long, at least hopefully they won't. And you can see temperatures come down a little bit, but it will remain warm and dry throughout this entire week for basically all of California. We can take a look at how dry it is today, and honestly, this afternoon is the time I'm most worried, and honestly right now, this is Monday morning, temperatures are already warm, could get up to the triple digits. I'd take these winds with a grain of salt. We're still going to see some 30 to 40 mile per hour wind gusts in some of the gaps and canyons, and humidity is in the teens. That's a very bad forecast, but the good news is it should be getting a little bit better throughout the day tomorrow as temperatures at least go down a little bit. Still warm, but not triple digits. Winds will calm down a bit too, will be more in that 15 to 20 mile per hour gust range, and then humidity is supposed to rise. So that's at least good news. Tomorrow is looking better. But again, throughout the day today, that's where conditions are looking extremely tricky as these wind gusts just push into this area where the fire is actively burning. See, Santa Rosa expected to be triple digits according to this forecast. But if we click through here, you will notice that the gusts throughout the day today, as we push into 8 p.m. tonight, the gusts should be calming down a bit. So that's good news. That's when that red flag warning ends. And then looking at tomorrow, we're still going to get those gusts into the 20, 25 mile per range, but it's not going to be 40s and 50s that has led to this fire just blowing up as much as it has. So when it comes to all the fires in California, I would say the glass fire is the number one fire that I'm watching right now, as it's actively growing and it has some really tricky conditions throughout the day today. Now, first thing you'll notice is how active the August complex looks here. I'll get to that one in a second. The first one I want to talk about in this very northern part of California is actually the North complex here, and that's because there have been some huge updates since my last video. You'll remember in my last video I was saying that the North complex was actually the fire I was feeling best about. They had seen some tricky weather conditions in the past and been able to handle them, and then their containment was just growing and growing every single day, so I was feeling good about the North complex, but unfortunately, this is the fire that saw some of the most extreme weather conditions over this last weekend, and it's led to some more growth in this fire that we weren't really expecting. So you'll remember in the last forecast, we just had some growth on this northern edge here, northeast, and south. And it wasn't looking all that extreme, and containment was getting up to almost 80%, so I was feeling pretty good about this one. What ended up happening though is we got some very extreme wind gusts up into the 50 to 60 mile per hour range coming from the northeast, which led to some unexpected growth on this northwestern side. I know because of this growth, there's actually been some new evacuations. So while I can't go over every single one of the evacuations, be sure to check the CAL FIRE website, as I'm pretty sure the entire town of Paradise is evacuated right now. Again, don't take my word on that though. Be sure to check the CAL FIRE website. So that's the key area I'm watching here, as those northeast wind gusts are actually continuing throughout the day today. And what that basically means is when you get those wind gusts pushing down like this, that leads to more fire growth right here, and unfortunately it can lead to some spotting. What that means is it can actually pick up some burning embers, throw them ahead of the fire, and start new little fires. So that's definitely the area I'm most concerned. You'll notice where there was some previous growth has calmed down in that northern, northeast, southern edge. Those areas have calmed down. The new concern, again, with this is on this northwestern edge being influenced by those extreme wind gusts. And you'll see how extreme these wind gusts look in a second when I get to the forecast. When it comes to the acreage with this one, it is up to 306,000 acres. So to put that into perspective, that's up about 5,000 since the last forecast. And while 5,000 doesn't sound all that extreme, it's a lot more than we expected, and this is another area that still has that red flag warning and has some really tricky conditions throughout the day today. You'll see our containment number has actually stayed about the same at 78%, and the reason for that is a lot of the growth that we're seeing right now is an area that they hadn't previously said was contained. You see, it shows that this red line here is where it's not contained, black line shows where there is containment, and the containment number stayed the same because our fire growth right now is in an area that wasn't previously contained, and that is where our growth is right now. You can see we are still uncontained on this northeastern and southern edge, but again, with those northeasterly wind gusts, this is the area where the most growth is expected. So when we actually get into the forecast for this one, you can see the red flag warning goes until about 9 p.m. tonight, and we're expected to be in the triple digits. Now, one of the reasons I'm now worried about this fire again, this used to be the fire I felt the best about, now I'm worried about it again, and that's because we're not going to get that big drop in temperatures like we're seeing in the more southern locations. This area could remain, and actually should remain, in the triple digits throughout this week. So that is certainly going to lead to some more rapid fire spread in the future throughout this week. And you can see the other thing I'm really worried about with this one, honestly, it's every aspect of this. It's hot, it's dry, and it's windy. And again, these wind gusts, these winds right here, I would take it with a grain of salt. We're seeing some 40 to 50 mile per hour gusts in this area. Unfortunately, humidity is getting into the low teens today, and there's not much recovery overnight. Now, the reason that overnight recovery is so important is because this is when firefighters could get a handle on the blaze as those temperatures drop down. They could get some good lines in, maybe do some firing operations. But when it stays this dry throughout the overnight hours, it leads to active fire behavior 24 hours a day. So it makes it hard to do some of those firing operations that you could get some good protective lines in with. So looking at the winds, it's actually easier to look at this map here. You see Oroville and Paradise right here. And again, we have some 45 mile per hour gusts going on right now. Now, just as the same as the South Bay, it should be calming down a bit throughout the day today, but 30 mile per hour gusts is still significant. And if that's what it says for this broad region, that means in some of the gaps and canyons, you're still going to be getting those 50 mile per hour gusts. Now, moving into Tuesday, you can see, unlike the glass fire where gusts went down to maybe 15 or 20 miles per hour, you can see Tuesday, they're actually going to continue and not really ease up until Wednesday, when they could be getting down into the teens. I would say this is the forecast I'm the most worried about, as it's going to be staying warm all week long, and we continue to see winds throughout Wednesday and Thursday. Again, not as bad as right now, but still rather more gusty than you'd like to see. So the next fire I want to talk about are these fires up here, and you're probably noticing the smoke plume right here because in the past we've said the eastern edge of the August complex was 100% contained. Well, that smoke plume right there isn't actually associated with the August complex. This is another one of our new fires. Now this one is called the Zogg fire. It started at 4 p.m. yesterday, and it's already up to 15,000 acres. And as you'd expect, it's at about 0% containment right now, as the major priorities are just getting people out of the populated areas that might be affected by this fire. Now, one other thing I will note, that's about as much information as I could find on the Zogg fire, so I'm going to be scouring the web looking for some resources, and when I find the information on this one, I will keep you guys updated. I'm sure this will be a fire I'll be talking about all week long. So the other fire you see here is the August complex, and you can see there is way more smoke than we were seeing all last week, and that's again because of those red flag conditions, dry, windy, also extremely hot. That's led to some new flare-ups with this fire that we weren't seeing towards the end of last week, as weather conditions were rather mild. So this fire is up to 878,000 acres. As always, this is the largest wildfire in the history of California. And like I said, you see a lot more smoke right now. That's because there's a lot of active fire growth with this one. And this number with the August complex is actually up 16,000 acres from my last video update on Thursday morning. Now, that's significant because that's actually the most fire growth we saw with any of our fires throughout the entire weekend. Now, if we actually look at this on the fire perimeter and hotspot map, you can see where some of this active fire growth is. Now, first thing I will point out is where the Zogg fire is. You can see it's just northeast of the August complex, and just like we saw with the glass fire, those hotspots are basically covering the entire fire perimeter, so it's actively growing in every direction. That's certainly one I'm going to be watching, and I'll keep you guys updated as this one progresses. Now, coming to the August complex, towards the end of last week, the number one spot we were talking about was this southwestern edge, and you can see there was some expansion in this area, but for the most part, it's looking pretty good right now. You can't see that many active hotspots on this edge. That's at least good news with this one. I know they put a ton of resources on the southwestern edge, so we're looking better there, as well as this eastern edge, still 100% containment. Where we do see a lot of active fire behavior is on this northern edge and this western edge here. Now again, just like the north complex, the main reason for that was those northeasterly wind gusts that have acted to just push this fire further and further west. There's been some spotting in this area. It's actually jumped some of the previous lines that were considered strong. So they're actively trying to get some new resources in here to get some new lines and hopefully stop some of this growth that we see. So again, big thing that's leading to this growth are those wind gusts pushing down, and we'll actually look at that when we check out the forecast in a second. So overall, we're at 45% containment, and you can see where some of that containment is in the north here. I'm mostly focusing on the north because that's where we still see our active fire growth. See, this entire western edge is considered contained as well as this eastern edge, but right where we see that active fire behavior, that's where we don't have strong enough lines to consider that area contained. So those are the two areas I'm continuing to watch. Now, when it comes to the forecast for this area, gusty winds are going to continue, but the one thing you'll notice is they aren't looking as nearly as gusty as we're seeing with the north complex over by Oroville and Paradise. But again, 25 miles per hour is still significant, and again, if you have 25 miles per hour over a broad region, there's likely some spots that are in that 35 to 40 range. Now, when it comes to the extended forecast pushing into Tuesday, you can see that some of those wind gusts are going to continue, as we could still see some 25 mile per hour wind gusts throughout Tuesday into Tuesday afternoon. When it comes to temperature in this area, this map isn't showing it to be about as warm as I'm actually expecting. You can see it shows high 80s, but I think some of these areas, especially around like Covello, could be into the triple digits. So that's something I'm definitely watching. And the same is true for humidity. That's probably the major factor that's playing a role with the August complex right now. Winds, they are gusty. Temperatures, you saw there were areas that were still in the 80s, but humidity is a huge factor as we get into those single digits, which is drying out a lot of the vegetation here. And a lot of the vegetation in this area is extremely thick. So when it's able to dry out, that's what can lead to a lot of that fire spread that we've been seeing, where that dry vegetation, topography, and winds just align. And that's why we're seeing the growth in those areas. So the next one I want to talk about is the Creek Fire and the Castle Fire, because as you can see, we're still getting a good amount of smoke from these two, and more smoke than we were actually seeing towards the end of last week. Now, one thing I will note, I want to actually zoom out on this map here because it'll show where the red flag warning is, and you can see it actually stops north of where the Creek and Castle fires are, so that's actually good news. The forecast for these fires is looking better, actually a lot better than the forecast for the North Complex, the August Complex, the Zogg Fire, and the Glass Fire. Now, I want to just zoom in on the Castle Fire first, because you can see where it's still actively growing. It's not nearly as bad as some of those days in the past where that entire southern edge was rapidly expanding out of the previous fire perimeter, but you do still see some hot spots on this northern edge here. Now, when it comes to the Castle Fire, I believe it's right here. You can see it's up to 150,000 acres, and it's at 50% containment. Now, when it comes to the Creek Fire, there's been some interesting things happening with this one. Again, this didn't see as extreme weather conditions as some of those more northern California fires, and it's reflective in the fire behavior map. You can see, especially on this western edge, significantly calmed down since last week. I know they actually had some military personnel in this area helping out. They got some great lines in, and you can see that western edge is looking a lot better. I'll also point out the other good news. This southern edge basically looks like there's no hotspots left. That's huge because that's where we were seeing some active growth throughout even last week when the weather conditions weren't that bad. So it's great to see that the hotspots and the growth in this area appears to be handled. Some other good news when it comes to this fire, well, it's never good news that the fire is still actively growing and advancing. As this fire actively grows and advances, though, we're actually pushing into more rocky terrain. So what that's doing is where there's more rocks, there's less fuel. So it's actually slowing down some of this growth. And as we continue to push further north and northeast here, it's just going to continue to push into rockier terrain. So it'll actually slow the growth even more. It's actually also burning into a previous fire. It was called the Lion Fire, and that was able to burn out some of the vegetation. So kind of great news on both aspects. Less vegetation because it's rocky terrain, also less vegetation because the Lion Fire had already previously burned out some of that. Again though, there are still some tricky weather conditions here, so I am still actively watching the Creek Fire. Now, one thing that I always find useful is to look at the Wharf S-Fire computer model. This is one of the best wildfire models really in the world because it pairs the fire below with the atmosphere above, which is so important because winds are often one of the key drivers of fire growth. And you'll see the northeastern winds and how they influence this fire. You can see it's extremely gusty on this western edge here as well as right here, and that's where you do continue to see some fire growth. So this is kind of what all our fires are looking like, these northeasterly winds pushing in, leading to some growth in that area. Now, one thing I always find helpful to do is go back to the beginning. This is what the fire perimeter looks like right now. And then, no, we don't want that. Okay, going back to the beginning, this is what the fire perimeter looks like right now. This is what the model is predicting it will look like in 2 days as these northeast winds influence this fire. So you can see exactly where those northeast winds were the strongest. That's where we saw some of the fire growth. I'll just do it one more time so you can focus on those two areas. You can see northeast winds come in, and that's where some growth is expected. So I will say this is an experimental forecast only. It doesn't take into account wildfire suppression tactics, so take it with a grain of salt, but it is interesting to see how those winds actually affect the fire. So Creek Fire, 304,000 acres. That's up 13,000 from my last forecast. So this did see some active growth over the weekend, and conditions aren't exactly good. So we will continue to see some growth with this one, although it's not going to be nearly as extreme as when this fire was first taken off and burning 100,000 acres a day. See, containment is up to 39% with this one. As always with evacuations, never take my word for it. When I say an area is looking good, be sure to check the CAL FIRE website. That's actually some great news here. While obviously it's never great news to say there's 855 structures destroyed, the good news is that with those 13,000 acres that burned over the weekend, it doesn't appear that any of those acres burned actually destroyed any new structures. This number has not changed over the weekend. So that's what I meant by good news there. This hasn't gone up in really the last 4 or 5 days. So hopefully that continues to stay just at this number right there. When it comes to personnel, you can see we still have over 3,000 personnel on this fire. So they still have a ton of resources on this. Although I'm expecting some of these resources will be relocated to help with the glass fire and possibly the Zogg fire as those continue to actively burn into some high populated areas, especially true with the glass fire. Now you can see we got 40 crews, 14 helicopters, 317 engines, 43 dozers, and 94 water tenders. Now, when it comes to the forecast, again, you don't see that red flag warning, so that's great news, but it's still above average temperatures, really staying the exact same throughout this entire week. We're in the low 90s, and then when we look at humidity, that's probably the thing I'm most concerned about with this fire. It's the fact that humidity and the air is just much drier than we saw last week. We could even be getting into the teens tomorrow afternoon. But again, those nighttime humidities are staying extremely low. It's never good when you just have a horizontal line with humidity here, because that means fire behavior is going to continue through the nighttime hours as the air remains dry and allows for fire growth to continue. So I'd say when it comes to this forecast, I'm not nearly as worried as some of those more northern fires, but I'm going to continue to watch the creek fire as humidity does remain low in this area. Now, the next one I will talk about is the Bobcat Fire. And with this fire, there's actually some great news. You can see that you can't really see anything. It looks like the smoke plume is completely gone from this area. In the past, that smoke plume was just blowing up into the more northern parts of the state, and I can't even see any smoke associated with this one anymore, and that's honestly some great news. When it comes to the Bobcat Fire, it only grew 1,000 acres over the entire weekend, which is huge because there were some tricky conditions. It was warm and dry all weekend long, and we only had about 1,000 acres burn. Now, one thing I will say, and the reason I am still reporting on this fire, even though there isn't all that much active growth, is there is a red flag warning throughout the day today. So while the Bobcat Fire isn't or doesn't appear to be actively growing, consider this almost a forecast for this entire area, as the weather conditions are going to be extremely tricky throughout the day today. Now, zooming into the Bobcat Fire, the area we were talking about the most was this area around Mount Wilson, and you can see there are still some active hotspots, but it's looking much better than it was all last week. You can see those hotspots aren't outside of the previous fire perimeter, and with the rest of the fire, the hotspots basically appear gone. We also saw some active growth on the northeastern edge here, and it looks like those hotspots are out as well. So when it comes to the Bobcat Fire, I'm actually feeling great. They do have some good lines around Mount Wilson. I'm not too concerned about that anymore. Obviously, I'm going to continue to watch this, as those red flag conditions today could lead to some extreme fire behavior in this area. So overall, the Bobcat Fire is looking good, but tricky weather conditions throughout the day today. So if we actually get in, you can see it's up to 114,000 acres. Like I said, only up 1,000 acres since my last report Thursday. Percent of perimeter contained is up to 62%, exactly what we want to see, and there's 1,300 personnel on this fire. We can actually look where this containment is. See, this entire northern edge is considered contained, as well as this entire southern edge, which is huge because that's where some of the populated areas are. Now you can see they don't consider the western edge here or the northeastern edge here contained, but looking at that hotspot map, it doesn't look like there's all that much fire going on anymore. So I'd imagine over the next few days, we'll hopefully see some containment lines be drawn in these areas. Again, that southwestern edge, that is the area I'm going to continue to watch, as red flag could combine with those active hotspots to possibly lead to some fire growth, but overall I'm feeling pretty good about this one. So that's kind of what's going on with the Bobcat Fire. Now I just want to almost do a forecast for the entire region, because when you get a red flag warning like this, that means there's a really good chance that if any new fire starts, it's going to rapidly grow. So it's important to look at the conditions, and you can see the red flag warning is in effect throughout the day today. So that basically means there's going to be some gusty winds and low humidities. And you can actually see it on this map, or not this map, but this little animation visualization figure right here. They're expecting some of these Santa Ana winds could be 35 to 40 miles per hour. So it could take one of those little hot spots, pick up a burning ember, place it elsewhere, and all of a sudden you've got a new fire. Now, I don't want to create any unnecessary fear, but that is something that could happen with these extreme winds. The other thing you don't want to see is how dry these conditions are. That's actually the thing I'm the most worried about in this area. Obviously, I'm worried about these possibly 40 mile per hour Santa Ana wind gusts, but humidity is actually the number one thing I'm worried about. And that's because, to be honest, this is the worst humidity graph I've ever seen. I don't think I can ever remember there being a 48-hour time period where humidity never reached at least 20%. You can see we're in the teens for the next 2 days. What that's going to do, combined with some of these warm temperatures, is really dry out some of this vegetation. And a lot of the vegetation in this area is already critically dry. So that's the thing I'm the most worried about, the fact that humidity is going to be in the single digits to teens for the next 2 days. Again, though, with those Santa Ana winds, if you're from SoCal, you know Santa Ana winds during wildfire season is never what you want to hear. And you can see we are expecting some gusts both this afternoon into tomorrow morning. So looking at that on the map, you can see where these gusts are coming in. Our fire is more around this area right here. But again, with these 40 to 45 mile per hour wind gusts in this area, I'm certainly watching this area closely for if any new fires will be popping up. If we take a look at the temperature here, you can see temperatures are also very warm. This is at 10 a.m. today. So if we go to 4 p.m. or 3 p.m., you can see we're getting into the 90s, possibly some high 90s in some areas. So again, Bobcat Fire is looking good, but conditions in this area are ripe for wildfire, so I'm going to be watching it closely. Taking a general look at all our wildfires, you can see how insane this season has been. Of the top 6 largest California wildfires of all time, 5 of them have burned this season, and when it comes to the August Complex, North Complex, and Creek Fire, they're actually still actively growing. Now, one thing to put this season in perspective, we've had over 3 million acres burned, which is the most we've ever had in recorded history. And unfortunately, I hate to say it, but this is the start of wildfire season. Some of our worst wildfire conditions are typically in October. And as humidities like this continue to just dry out vegetation, by the time we get into the peak season, we're going to continue to have these extremely tricky conditions. So I'm going to be with you guys every step of the way. I will keep these wildfire forecasts and updates going until the rains come and wildfire can just be put behind us. As always, thank you to CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service for all the amazing work you do, and to San Jose State and Dr. Craig Clements for teaching me everything I know about wildfire. Again, I will have an update tomorrow morning, and thanks for watching.